On Wednesday morning, flames rose from the shores of Bushehr province in southern Iran, where the largest natural gas field on Earth had just been struck by Israeli warplanes. Hours later, Tehran issued a chilling warning. 5 energy facilities across Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates would be hit in retaliation. And as if that were not enough, an Iranian military spokesperson went on state television to announce that weapons never before used were being deployed in this war, with more to come. On day 19 of the conflict between the United States, Israel, and Iran, the war crossed a threshold that experts had feared from the start. The moment energy infrastructure becomes a deliberate target on both sides, threatening not only the Middle East but the economic stability of the entire planet. What happened on March 18th may well be the inflection point that determines whether this conflict remains a devastating but contained military campaign or spirals into a global economic catastrophe. On March 18, 2026, Israeli forces struck the South Pars natural gas field and its associated facilities near Asaluye on Iran's Persian Gulf coast. According to Iran's semi-official Fars and Tasnim news agencies, refineries and petrochemical plants were hit, and emergency services were working to contain fires. An Israeli official confirmed to the Jerusalem Post that the attack was coordinated with the United States and targeted Iran's largest gas facility in Bushehr province. A senior American official, however, told CNN that the strike was carried out by Israel alone, not by U.S. forces directly. The South Pars field is not an ordinary target. It is the world's largest natural gas reserve, shared with Qatar across the Persian Gulf, where it is known as the North Field. According to the Associated Press, the field primarily supplies Iran's domestic energy needs. Iran is the 4th largest consumer of natural gas in the world, behind the United States, China, and Russia, according to the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University. Disrupting South Pars does not merely affect exports, it threatens the electricity and heating supply of 88 million Iranians. The same day, Iran's army spokesperson Amir Akraminia declared on state television that Iran had employed weapons in this war that it had never used before, promising that additional weaponry would be deployed in the coming days. Separately, Israeli military officials confirmed that Iran has been escalating its use of cluster munitions, warheads that release dozens of smaller bomblets over wide areas, at a frequency far exceeding that of the June 2025 conflict. According to the Israel Defense Forces, roughly half of all ballistic missiles fired at Israel during this war have carried cluster warheads. On Tuesday night, a cluster missile struck the Tel Aviv suburb of Ramat Gan, killing a couple in their 70s who could not reach their safe room in time. Iran also followed through on its threat against Gulf neighbors. According to Bloomberg, Qatar's Ras Laffan industrial city, housing the world's largest liquefied natural gas export plant, suffered what state-owned Qatar Energy described as extensive damage from an Iranian attack. Qatar responded by expelling Iran's military and security attachés, ordering them to leave the country within 24 hours. To understand how we arrived at this point, one must trace a chain of escalation that stretches back years. The broader Middle Eastern crisis that erupted in late 2023 fundamentally reshaped the region's security architecture. Iran and Israel exchanged direct missile strikes in 2024, breaking a long-standing pattern of indirect confrontation through proxies. Then came the 12-day war of June 2025, when Israel and the United States launched airstrikes against Iran that significantly degraded its nuclear program and missile infrastructure, but did not eliminate them. According to U.S. intelligence assessments cited by Al Jazeera, before the June 2025 strikes, Iran was less than 2 weeks away from enriching enough uranium for a single nuclear weapon. The International Atomic Energy Agency had acknowledged that Iran's accumulation of near-weapons-grade material had no clear civilian justification. Those strikes bought time, but they also deepened the hostility between Tehran, Washington, and Jerusalem. In January 2026, Iran experienced the largest wave of popular protests since the 1979 Islamic Revolution. The demonstrations were fueled by a crumbling economy, failing infrastructure, and widespread discontent with the regime. Iranian security forces responded with massive force, killing thousands of protesters, according to multiple human rights organizations. President Donald Trump threatened military action against the regime for the killings. Indirect nuclear negotiations, mediated by Oman, resumed in February 2026 and showed what Omani Foreign Minister Badr bin Hamad al-Busaidi described as real progress. But those talks collapsed. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched a coordinated surprise attack on multiple targets across Iran. The strikes killed Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei at the Leadership House compound in Tehran, along with dozens of senior officials, including members of his family. According to CBS News, around 40 Iranian officials were killed in the initial wave. The Trump administration stated the objectives included regime change, the destruction of Iran's missile and nuclear capabilities, and the dismantling of its regional proxy network. Iran responded with a massive retaliatory barrage. On the first day alone, the country launched approximately 350 ballistic missiles and more than 800 drones at Israel, U.S. bases across the region, and Gulf states hosting American forces, according to publicly available data compiled by Al Jazeera. An interim leadership council was established on March 1st, and on March 8th, Mojtaba Khamenei, the son of the slain supreme leader, was elected as his successor. This conflict involves an extraordinarily complex web of actors, each pursuing distinct strategic objectives. The United States, under President Trump, has articulated a range of goals that observers describe as sometimes inconsistent. These include destroying Iran's ballistic missile and nuclear capabilities, degrading its navy and drone production, ending its support for regional proxies, securing free passage through the Strait of Hormuz, and creating conditions for regime change. According to the Atlantic Council, Washington's stated aims have expanded significantly from the more limited objectives of the June 2025 strikes. Trump has publicly called for Iran's unconditional surrender and expressed displeasure with the selection of Mojtaba Khamenei as the new supreme leader, calling him lightweight and suggesting he would not last without American approval. Israel's interests are deeply rooted in existential security concerns. For decades, Iran has been openly committed to Israel's destruction, funding, and arming proxy groups, Hezbollah, Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and the Houthis, that have launched tens of thousands of rockets and missiles at Israeli civilians over 20 years, as the Atlantic Council noted. Israel sees this conflict as a historic opportunity to dismantle the Iranian threat permanently. Prime Minister Netanyahu's government has pursued an aggressive campaign of targeted killings, including the assassination of Ali Larijani, Secretary of Iran's Supreme National Security Council, on March 17th, and Iranian Intelligence Minister Esmail Khatib on March 18th. Iran, under its new leadership, has framed the conflict as a fight for national survival and Islamic revolutionary identity. The regime under Mojtaba Khamenei has rejected ceasefire proposals according to analysis by modern diplomacy and appears to be pursuing a war of attrition. As Hamidreza Azizi, a visiting fellow at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, told Al Jazeera, Tehran's central calculation is that Gulf states and Israel may exhaust their defensive capabilities, particularly missile interceptors, before Iran runs out of offensive weapons. Iran has decentralized its missile command to rely more heavily on mobile launchers, which are harder for U.S. and Israeli surveillance to detect and destroy. The Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, and Oman find themselves in an agonizing position. They are not participants in the military campaign against Iran, yet they host American military installations that Iran considers legitimate targets. Their civilian infrastructure has suffered repeated strikes. Qatar's foreign ministry condemned the Israeli strike on South Pars, with spokesman Majed Al-Ansari noting that the gas field is an extension of Qatar's own North Field. Yet Qatar also expelled Iranian military attachés after the retaliatory strike on Ras Laffan. These nations face the impossible dilemma of being caught between an aggressive American ally and a retaliating Iranian neighbor. Hezbollah has reopened a front in Lebanon, attacking Israeli territory in solidarity with Iran. Israel has responded with extensive airstrikes across Lebanon, killing more than 900 people according to the Lebanese government and Bloomberg. The Lebanese government has sought to disarm Hezbollah, but the group retains substantial military capability and support in Shia communities. The economic consequences of this conflict are already reverberating far beyond the Middle East. The strike on South Pars sent energy markets into turmoil. According to Bloomberg, Brent crude climbed 3.8% to settle at $107.38 per barrel on Wednesday, while European gas benchmark prices surged 6%. CNN reported Brent briefly jumped 5% to nearly $109 per barrel, and U.S. West Texas Intermediate crude rose to $98.65. Crude oil prices have risen approximately 40% since the war began on February 28, according to CNN. The true choke point, however, is the Strait of Hormuz. According to data compiled by energy intelligence firm Kepler, roughly 13 million barrels of oil per day passed through the strait in 2025, representing about 31% of all seaborne crude flows. Since the start of the war, transit through the strait has effectively collapsed. Kepler estimates that only about 90 ships have passed through the waterway since the conflict began, a fraction of normal traffic. The IRGC warned that any vessel attempting transit would be targeted, and Iran has carried out at least 21 confirmed attacks on merchant ships, according to reporting compiled by multiple outlets. The International Energy Agency announced a coordinated release of 400 million barrels from strategic reserves on March 11th, the largest in its history. Yet as Hamid al-Dandani told Al Jazeera, emergency reserves cannot replace the sustained function of a disrupted shipping corridor. The U.S. Strategic Petroleum Reserve held approximately 415 million barrels as of mid-February 2026, according to the U.S. Department of Energy, with a maximum drawdown capacity of 4.4 million barrels per day, at global consumption rates of roughly 105 million barrels per day. According to the U.S. Energy Information Administration, the math is sobering. American consumers are already feeling the impact. According to CNN, the nationwide average gasoline price has risen by 86 cents in just 18 days, a 29% jump, one of the fastest increases on record, comparable to the price shock during Hurricane Katrina in 2005. Gas now averages $4 or more per gallon in 7 U.S. states and has topped $5 in California, Hawaii, and Washington, according to 8AA data cited by CNN. Asia faces the most acute vulnerability. According to CNBC, citing Kepler data, Qatar and the UAE account for 99% of Pakistan's liquefied natural gas imports, 72% of Bangladesh's, and 53% of India's. Japan obtains about 70% of its Middle Eastern oil through shipments that pass through the Strait of Hormuz. Goldman Sachs economists have raised their probability of a U.S. recession this year by 5 percentage points to 25%, according to Axios. The events of March 18th have prompted sharply divergent analyses from experts and institutions. Danny Citrinowicz, a senior researcher at the Institute for National Security Studies in Tel Aviv, described the strikes on South Pars as a clear turning point in the conflict. Speaking to CNN, he suggested the attack signals a shift in President Trump's strategic thinking. Citrinowicz noted that Trump had previously appeared reluctant to damage assets crucial to Iran's future economic recovery, but this strike indicates a reassessment of those limits. From the Iranian perspective, Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi told Al Jazeera that the Islamic Republic's political structure remains resilient and capable of absorbing leadership losses. President Masoud Pezeshkian warned on the social media platform X that targeting Iran's energy infrastructure could lead to uncontrollable consequences, and that such actions will complicate the situation and may lead to uncontrollable repercussions whose effects extend to engulf the entire world. Analysts at the Atlantic Council have noted a growing potential divergence between Israeli and American war objectives. While both governments share an interest in degrading Iran's military capabilities, the prospect of regime collapse, followed by potential chaos, civil war, cross-border instability, and refugee flows, is of far greater concern to Washington and its Arab partners than to Jerusalem. According to the Atlantic Council assessment, if such a gap opens, Trump is likely to be the one who determines when the war ends, potentially imposing an endpoint on Israel even if Israeli objectives remain unmet. The cluster munitions question has drawn its own body of analysis. Ephraim Inbar, cited by CNN, argued that with Iran's ballistic missile capacity severely degraded, cluster warheads have become the weapon of choice for maximizing damage with fewer launches. An Israeli military official told the Wall Street Journal that cluster munitions have been used on a nearly daily basis. The Foundation for Defense of Democracies noted in its analysis that Iran's use of cluster munitions underscores the urgency of completing the destruction of Iran's ballistic missile production capacity. On the broader strategic picture, the Al Jazeera opinion piece by an analyst citing publicly available data noted that Iranian ballistic missile launches have fallen by more than 90% from 350 on February 28 to roughly 25 by March 14. The U.S. military has achieved what analysts describe as near-total air dominance over Iran, flying non-stealth B-1 bombers through Iranian airspace, a decision that signals confidence in air superiority. Yet Iran retains enough capability to inflict significant damage, as Wednesday's attacks on Israeli and Qatari targets demonstrated. The reverberations of this conflict now extend to virtually every corner of the global economy. The effective closure of the Strait of Hormuz has been described by the LSE Business Review as the defining economic dimension of the war. Analyst Mohsen Kezri characterized the strait as an economic clock of war, arguing that a short closure creates an oil shock, while a prolonged one becomes a broader inflation and growth shock. Oxford Economics modeled a scenario with oil averaging $140 per barrel for 2 months, concluding it would push the Eurozone, the United Kingdom, and Japan into economic contraction. Goldman Sachs raised its U.S. inflation forecast by 0.8 percentage points and trimmed its growth forecast accordingly, according to Axios. The disruption extends far beyond oil. According to CNBC, about 85% of polyethylene exports from the Middle East transit through the Strait of Hormuz, affecting packaging, automotive components, and consumer goods worldwide. Fertilizer shipments are being disrupted, threatening agricultural production in multiple regions. Aluminum shipments from the UAE face similar constraints. Major shipping companies Maersk and Hapag-Lloyd have suspended Middle East routes. In South Asia, the impact is already acute. Pakistan and Bangladesh face potential power sector disruptions due to their near-total dependence on Gulf liquefied natural gas, according to Kepler analyst Go Katayama. India faces what analyst Bob McNally, a former advisor to President George W. Bush, described to CBS News as an acute crisis, given its heavy reliance on energy shipments through the strait and relatively limited strategic reserves. Russia, notably, appears to be a strategic beneficiary. According to Kepler's analysis, the conflict has materially improved Russia's competitive position in crude oil markets, as both India and China face strong incentives to deepen their reliance on Russian supply to replace disrupted Gulf flows. Saudi Arabia has activated its east-west pipeline to reroute some exports to the Red Sea, but this infrastructure cannot fully replace normal Hormuz flows. Iraq reached a deal to resume limited crude exports via Turkey's Tehran port at a rate of 250,000 barrels per day, described by Saxo strategist Neil Wilson as a drop in the ocean. The United Kingdom has permitted the use of its military bases at Diego Garcia and RAF Fairford for American operations, though the Prime Minister stated this was for specific and limited defensive purposes. A drone struck Britain's Akrotiri base in Cyprus. The House of Commons Library published a briefing noting the conflict's spread to at least a dozen countries. Several developments in the coming days and weeks will be critical indicators of this conflict's trajectory. First, Iran's follow-through on its threat to strike 5 named energy facilities in Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar will be the most immediate test of escalation. Saudi Aramco has reportedly already evacuated personnel from its Samref refinery. Whether these attacks materialize and at what scale will shape the economic and diplomatic response of the entire Gulf region. Second, the status of the Strait of Hormuz remains the central variable for the global economy. On March 17th, Iraq's oil minister said he was in contact with Iran to negotiate allowing some ships to pass. Trump has abandoned efforts to recruit European and Asian partners for a naval escort mission. Whether any diplomatic arrangement can restore even partial commercial transit will determine if the energy shock deepens or stabilizes. Third, the military balance deserves close attention. Iran's missile launch rate has declined dramatically, but the shift to cluster munitions and the claim of never-before-used weapons suggest Tehran is adapting tactically. The nature of these undisclosed weapons, whether they represent a genuine new capability or are primarily rhetorical, will become clearer in the coming days. Fourth, the IAEA's monitoring of the Bushehr nuclear power plant, where a projectile reportedly landed near the facility on Tuesday, introduces a deeply concerning nuclear safety dimension. Russia's Rosatom confirmed that about 480 Russian citizens remain at the plant. Finally, the next scheduled OPEC+ meeting on April 5th will be a pivotal moment for energy markets, though the group can convene earlier. Whether producers can reroute enough supply to soften the price shock, or whether prices continue their trajectory toward levels that trigger recession in major importing economies, may define the global economic outlook for the remainder of 2026. What unfolded on March 18, 2026, was not simply another day of military strikes in an already brutal conflict. It was the day energy infrastructure, the lifeblood of nations and the circulatory system of the global economy, became an explicit battlefield. The attack on South Pars and the retaliatory strikes on Ras Laffan represent a crossing of a line that makes de-escalation vastly more difficult and the economic consequences vastly more severe. Iran is adapting its weapons and tactics even as its conventional capacity erodes. The United States and Israel are expanding their target sets even as they seek to contain the conflict's geographic spread. And the rest of the world, from gasoline stations in Texas to power grids in Dhaka, is being drawn into the consequences of decisions made in Tehran, Washington, and Jerusalem. 19 days into this war, one thing is increasingly clear. The longer it continues, the wider and deeper its scars will be. Not only on the Middle East, but on the global order that has relied for decades on the assumption that energy would keep flowing through one narrow strait.